Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Karen. So happy to be here.
Um, Stephen, if anyone is not familiar, um, was a professor here at MassArt, and he's going to be speaking about his experiences with Indigo, which include studying indigo in Nigeria, studying about indigo dyeing in Nigeria, and now he is found himself back to school in getting a PhD at Harvard in African history, specifically looking at dyes. So why don't you take it from here, Stephen?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karen. So, as Karen said, my name is Stephen Hamilton. I was a professor at MassArt. I'm also a graduate from MassArt. I'm currently studying African history at Harvard, getting my PhD focused on traditional dyeing in Africa, textile histories in Africa, especially deep textile histories in Africa. And all of that really started when I had the opportunity to travel to Nigeria between 2015 and 2016. So I was a recipient of the Arts Connect International Artist in Residency Program. I received a grant in order to travel internationally, and I had the opportunity to travel to the Nikkei Center for Art and Culture in Nigeria. And it's awesome because I saw you'll be speaking to Gasali, who is also from Nigeria and is also associated with the Nikkei Center and is a legendary Aladire and Alaro from Nigeria. So it was through that experience that I learned traditional weaving, dyeing, and wood carving, and sort of like started my trajectory as a natural dyer, as somebody very interested in the history of natural dyeing and weaving in Africa. And it was there that my practice was very much transformed. So you'll see in the first slide examples of both Adire Oniko, which is a tie and dye dyed with indigo and kola nut. And they're on Guinea brocade, which is a machine woven fabric, and also using hand woven fabrics as well. So I wanted to start off by paying homage to the plant, the source of indigo that I learned dyeing with. So there are numerous sources of indigo. Um, Indigo is not only particular to species in the Indigofera genus. There are numerous different genuses of plants that produce indigo. And there's also species of animals that produce indigo. If anybody's familiar with Tyrian purple, snails in the Murex family also produce indigo and indigo precursors. But this species of indigo, which is Phalaenoptera cyanescens, is considered the strongest source of indigo dye in Africa and is oftentimes treasured as the most potent source of the dye. So when I learned indigo dyeing in Nigeria, we were using this plant. We were using plant material from Phalaenoptera cyanescens, which in Yoruba is called elu. So I just wanted to walk you through the process that I learned. So typically what happens is the fresh green leaves of the elu plant are gathered and they're pounded in a mortar to create like these balls, which are allowed to dry in the sun. And this is the major like dye matter which is used in parts of southern Nigeria. So usually what happens is over 100, about 120 or 140 of these balls are broken up and put into a pot to create a very strong dye solution. So typically when you have indigo, you have your indigo plant matter. And when you're dyeing directly from the plant matter, there's a lot of different ways in which you can reduce the dye. Typically in Nigeria, they're using a fermentation process where they're allowing it to ferment in a rich alkaline liquor, a rich lye solution. So typically they would use either cocoa pod ashes or wood ashes from specific trees to get the dye vat or the dye pot to the appropriate pH. So this is an example of them making the aluba. which is the name for the alkaline solution, the lye solution that they would use to ferment the dye and get the desired pH for the vat. And these are examples of like, this is like all of the different alu balls which are broken up and put in the dye pit. So when I learned indigo dyeing, the way in which they sped up this process was by actually adding boiling water to the vat before they're adding the aluba. So you're letting it soak in very hot water. You're adding the alkaline solution so it's at the desired pH. You're covering the vat and then you're allowing it to ferment. And what that fermentation process is doing is it's removing oxygen from the vat so that your indigo precursors, your indican can transition into leuco-indigo or indigo yellow, which is actually what you're dyeing with. So this is an example of a reduced pot with a very strong flower at the top. You see some bits of that flower that that's coming off on the tied kijikpa, which is like the handwoven fabric that I was using for some of the pieces. And during this time, which was the second time where I was dyeing in Nigeria, me and my teacher, Miss Agnes Umeche, were dyeing kijikpa, other forms of adire, oniko, using raffia and using tie and dye on machine woven fabric. And we're also dyeing a lot of yarn. So you'll see some images of us dyeing our adire, and also us dyeing a lot of yarn that we're using for a weaving project that we were doing when we were there in Nigeria. So these are some examples of like the first instance, what first exposed me to indigo dyeing using that natural process. And it was a very interesting experience because I was also learning about traditional weaving. Weaving and dyeing industries in southern Nigeria were very intimately related, especially in the space where I was in. So I was learning how to weave on the upright loom, which is the oldest loom used in Nigeria. So you'll see the men's weaving tradition, which is very similar to kente, these long horizontal looms that are also used by Yoruba men. And then the traditional upright loom, which is used by Yoruba women, and also used by women of different ethnic groups. So for example, my teacher is Egbira, which is another ethnic group in Nigeria that also uses this upright loom. So I was learning how those two histories are very deeply intertwined. Women dominated upright loom weaving, as well as cotton spinning and indigo dyeing. And it also shows the relationships between cotton and indigo, which are very long-standing, and also very interesting to me as a researcher and also as a weaver and a dyer. So these are just some more images of me in Nigeria and sort of reflecting on that very formative experience that I had. And these are some examples of adire that I made. The middle one is actually a piece that I wove and dyed completely myself. So I wove the piece of kijikpa, and then I also dyed it myself. So this was like something that I made like completely from scratch when I was there. We have other examples of indigo dyed yarn, and also yarn which is dyed with kola nut, and another type of dye which is sourced from sorghum leaves, which gives like this very bright red color which fades to a rust color over time. And some more images of like kola nut and indigo dyeing. And I wanted to take a little bit of time to like sort of think about what sort of set me on a trajectory as a researcher, as somebody who's really interested in sort of like the tactile understanding of these histories and understanding the very long histories of textile production in West Africa, specifically in this region of West Africa, and looking at the relationships that they have with Atlantic trade, with the transatlantic slave trade, and with like the commercial histories of Nigeria. So this weaving tradition, the production of these indigo and cotton hand-woven cloths that were woven on upright looms has a very intimate history in the history of the transatlantic slave trade. Specifically the production of large amounts of these textiles for the exchange of enslaved people. So they enslaved people in gold. So Europeans were actually purchasing large amounts of these textiles as early as the 15th century, late 15th century, for exchange with other African groups. And what they were actually doing is that they were tacking on to longer histories of exchange on the African continent that focused on textiles, specifically cotton and indigo textiles. So the images that you're seeing are actually of female dyers and spinners in Igbomina, which is also one of the areas known for the production of large amounts of these types of textiles. So these textiles are being exported, but they also have these very, very intimate histories and relationships and social histories that are tied to the towns in which they're produced. So again, you see an image of this woman who's dyeing in the traditional ikoko aro, which are the dye pots which are used by the Yoruba people. When I had the opportunity to return to the United States, when I came back to the United States, I was still very interested in weaving and dyeing. It became a very important part of my practice as an image maker. So I was like quickly trying to like learn how I could continue that practice in the United States. While I don't have access to like an indigo pod, and I'm not in a climate very conducive of producing indigo, but I was like learning about different reduction methods using pre-reduced indigo, and also learning about thinking about how I could incorporate natural dyeing into my research practice. So studying the histories of natural dyeing in West Africa and trying to reproduce those effects in the studio. So you see images of like hand-woven cloth and hand-dyed cloth that I produced when I came back to the United States. And also thinking about the continuation of my practice as a weaver while I was back here in the United States. So this is an image of a Yoruba woman weaving, and this is an image of me weaving on my loom that I built here in the United States. Also using hand-dyed yarns that are dyed with indigo and camwood. And again, more images of hand-woven textiles that I've produced since coming back here using natural dyes that have their origins on the African continent. And again, more images of these like hand-woven fabrics, which are also incorporating motifs and techniques that are associated with weaving traditions in southern Nigeria. And what you're seeing is a textile which is dyed with indigo and camwood, which are two important dyes. The silk is dyed with camwood, with barwood powder that has been gone through extraction process using alcohol. And again, more images of like weaving that I've done since I've come back here. And also images of how I incorporate this into my artistic practice. So my background was in illustration. So a lot of the work that I was doing before I went to Nigeria was like large scale painting. Again, I was very much interested in the histories of pre-colonial Africa, but that was sort of limited to depictions of material culture related to pre-colonial Africa. So these narrative images, which are incorporating iconography from pre-colonial Africa. And when I was in Nigeria, I was thinking about how I could actually incorporate the material into the artistic practice. So the image that you're seeing here, Dance of the Tidal Mothers, is painted on the fabric. So thinking about the relationship between textiles and indigo and these titled women's societies in Nigeria, and actually incorporating the material culture associated with that into the work, into the images. And that just became a very common part of the practice. Like, how am I thinking about these textile traditions and having that be an integral part of the painting? So you see the hand-woven fabric. That beautiful red color that you're seeing is made with hessian or burlap that's dyed with barwood, which produces this really beautiful like red-brown color on jute and raffia. And again, thinking about how the subject matter and the material itself can be tied together. Again, thinking about like these ideas that are very important in Yoruba religion, in Igbo religion, in the religious practices of numerous ethnic groups across West and West Central Africa, each with their own textile traditions, which are intertwined with these traditional worldviews, and thinking about how that can work into my practice as a painter. So again, these are images of indigo cloth, and then we also have indigo and camwood for the sleeve at the top. And then these images that are painted on top of them and then incorporated into the subject matter. I wanted to briefly highlight my experience as a teacher. So one of the things that was very important to me was, having this experience in Nigeria was life-changing for me, and also was very grounding. And when I got back to the US, I was really interested in thinking about how I could sort of share these histories and these experiences with youth of African descent back in Boston. So, through a grant through NIFA, I had the opportunity to teach traditional weaving and dyeing to a group of young people in Boston, many of which were young people that I worked with before I went to Nigeria. So you can see examples of students weaving on upright looms that we made from moving pallets. You can see Miss Falilat, who's working on her own loom in Nigeria, and see like how those traditions are being brought back to the US. We wanted to, I'm going to be very honest here. I really wanted to, do the whole real natural. I had brought over a loom from Nigeria to the United States. And I was like, we're going to make a working indigo vat, and it didn't work. So we had to use the not very practical, we had to use the not very sustainable, chemical reduction process for this, which I ideally wouldn't want to do, but it did allow me to teach like that process and teach what was happening with indigo, and sort of share that experience with the young people that I was teaching these histories and these traditions to. And we were able to use other natural dyes. We were using kola nut, we were using sorghum leaves, but we created a large scale installation that was at Atlantic Wharf using those techniques back in 2017. And again, you can see some more images of weaving and dyeing, working with the young people that I worked with there. These were young folks. This is Tatiana, Adriana, and Jordan, who were part of the program. I just wanted to end sort of this presentation to like go over like the next steps in my indigo journey. I still work a lot with indigo. These are beautiful results from a henna vat, which I feel is probably the closest to like the sort of results that I've gotten in Nigeria. The color that it gives, this very dark, very warm blue that it gives, even the smell of it is not as potent as like the fermented indigo, but it's still reminiscent of it. And it also is more similar to practices that you'll see in other parts of West Africa, where they're adding some sort of plant material that is very high, very flavonoid rich to the indigo bath to aid in the reduction process. And I'm sort of like thinking about like how I'm incorporating these, like really exploring ways in which I can like sort of, have a sustainable indigo practice, but also thinking about like how that relates to the results that I'm getting as a dyer, using natural indigo, using other natural dyes, and sort of thinking about how that allows me to sort of get, sort of produce these works that are more in line with like my own desires as an artist, and desires as an artist is very interested in thinking about how I'm sort of embodying these arts in my own practice, like looking at these ancient traditions and embodying them in my own practice. So yeah, that pretty much brings me up. This is a glossing of like my trajectory over the past 5 years, but that brings me sort of brings us up to date now. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions that people have.
I think I'm going to jump in with some questions first. Thank you so much, Stephen. I am so curious as to how you're taking your experiences from your own dyeing and your own investigation, and how are you utilizing that to guide you through your graduate work now?
I'm glad that I'm very glad that you asked that. It becomes incredibly helpful because As you know, sometimes when you're looking at textile histories, there's like a lot of very beautiful work that's written, but it's not always written by people who have an actual practice as a weaver and as a dyer. So as somebody who weaves, as somebody who dyes cloth, I sort of have a better understanding of how these objects are created, and sort of understanding the different processes which are important, that are like sort of fundamental to getting the particular results that we're seeing in specific textiles. So a good example is when looking at camwood, barwood, people get a little bit upset when you conflate the two. Camwood is typically from Boffia species in the Boffia genus, and barwood is typically species that are in the Pterocarpus genus. The active chemical agents, the dyes, the dyeing agents are pretty much the same. They're these red flavonoids that are present in both genuses of plants, both genera of plants. But when looking at how people are describing the process for dyeing, me as a dyer who works with that material, understanding that these are not soluble in water, you can't just boil them and get the color. Well, then thinking about, okay, how are they getting these like very strong, fast colors? And it's like, okay, in the studio experimenting with soda ash, experimenting with gum, with trona, experimenting with these like available alkaline additives, and seeing like how like these different colors are being produced, and then also looking at other people who are observing the dyeing process using other these additives. So from looking at that and having my own practice, I could look and say, okay, they're getting this very beautiful like rust orange color. So like this is like an example of raffia that's dyed with barwood. And what I did is I went to my African food store and I bought trona, I bought, soda, rock soda that's available there, and I added that to the dye bath. And when I did that, I got this color that I also see in textiles, from Democratic Republic of Congo, from Nigeria, that are made before the introduction of synthetic dyes. So it's like looking at that color and then also looking at that there and knowing that this was an additive that would have been available to people, and begin to like reconstruct like what are those possibilities. Adding ferrous sulfate to the bath and seeing like getting these really dark purple colors, and then also seeing like, those same colors that exist in like these examples that you're seeing in museum collections. Then also like experimenting myself, and also thinking about myself as somebody who's like not only generating this knowledge, but also putting myself in the space of these artisans who are generating knowledge. And that's something that's very important that people forget, is that the women who, because it's mostly women in a lot of these places who are doing the dyeing, who are discovering these techniques, are generating knowledge. You hear people talk about things like in the Mande speaking world about the jiriro, which is the science of leaves, or the science of trees, or knowledge of trees, which is imparted by the plants themselves. So thinking about how people are observing their natural environment and learning from their natural environment, and understanding the methodologies which they can use to extract color, to extract medicine, to understand the metaphysical or ritual properties of specific materials. There's a saying by Mende women that say that there are many leaves that produce color, but only God knows how to extract the color from each of those, and then thinking about like the ways in which these leaves and these plants lend their knowledge to those who are willing to listen, for those who embody good character, for those who are willing to study. And then also understanding that like when we're looking at these objects or we're reading about them, they're the product of this embodied knowledge that is being created and generated by these African people. So by doing my own work, I'm placing myself in that space.
That's fabulous. I think that, students that have heard me speak, know that part of my fascination is that how we as human beings developed around the world, and the critical part that indigo played in that development. that, how, when you have something that's not water soluble,
Mhm.
how do you learn that? Does that take 500 years to learn? Does it
Mhm.
take, what is its gestation for learning? Because it was learned in so many places around the world.
Exactly, exactly. It's such a fascinating, it's such a it's such a fascinating history. And then thinking about all the different possibilities that come from that. Because each of these dyes are also medicine. And
Mhm.
they're also like, I have like my own theories about like indigo, because indigo also is used internally and topically as a medicine. And it's also an additive that's added to other blue-black dyes,
Mm.
that are more widespread on the continent. So like, what is this process in which people are understanding that like these particular processes allow this color to be more fast on
Mm.
an object, or like what are like these like different ways in which people are discovering that, and how much of it is trial and error. Um, and I think that that also brings into like one of the questions that was asked, like Suzanne asked about the spiritual connection between nature and the plant and the dye. It's like these things are not separate. So like these as spiritually potent materials and as medicinal materials and as artistic materials, they're all so closely related to each other. And that all is sort of driving this sort of way in which people are developing this knowledge around them. So like even coming to the understanding that like, okay, this is the process in which you make indigo usable as a dye, isn't separated from like, these are the properties that make indigo a medicine. These are the properties which make indigo a spiritually charged substance. And then what does it mean for the people who figure this out? And I think about that in the context of, Yoruba women, in Mende women, like these women learn this, and then they are associated with this spiritual potency and power. And then all these other taboos and all these other ritual significance become attached to the dyer, because they figured out how to perform this magic. Because if you see indigo work, and I think you all who are in MassArt, you'll have the opportunity for Karen to show you like the magic of how indigo works. You lift it up, and then it transforms from green into blue. And then like, what does that mean for like the women who like understand how to do that, you know and I mean that for those contexts, in other parts of the African continent, like indigo dyers are men. But like, what does it mean for those who understand that process?
This is just an amazing thing to think about. I mean, and to think about, I don't know much about dying in Mali, but I know that it's a different process. And so I think the fascination for me is just that, you know, really just that human beings, how humans have learned what they've learned,
Mm-hmm.
the natural way of living in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's so much richness. I would love to have some questions from the audience. I think that it's a small enough group that, let's see, Stephen, if you wanted to stop screen sharing,
Oh,
that we could have people turn on their cameras and join in the conversation.
I'll
Barbara.
I'll jump in. It probably isn't a question, but Stephen, I love the way you incorporate the thought processes and the traditions of what you're doing as another layer on your artwork, on your paintings. I love seeing that cloth. I have always included the fact that my textile art was a textile. I never allowed an installer to stretch a bar on the bottom of my hangings to make them straight so they won't ripple. And when I was asked about that, I said, I know I want people to read it as a textile
Mm.
with more meaning on it. And I think what you're doing there is just lovely. It really resonates with me.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, that means a lot.
And the traditions that you're learning about, and the problem you're running into in a northern climate, not being able to make a tropical dye vat, you may want to look into what's called the Swedish vat, or the cold vat, or the iron
Yeah,
sulfate vat.
the copper's vat, yeah.
The copperas, which is not copper, it's iron sulfate. That works in a cold climate. That's what I use all the time, and it's great on bast fibers and on paper and other substrates because it has a fairly high pH.
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
happy to share.
Yeah, I've been reading up on that one. That one is like a really potent one. I've used iron sulfate before as an additive. I'm still that one also makes me a little bit nervous, but I do want to experiment with it. I do want to experiment with it. I know that you get very beautiful colors from using an iron reduction.
Yeah. Okay.
Steven,
Hello.
hi. So speaking of nervous, this is what I was thinking of almost the whole time. So you weave all that beautiful, beautiful fabric and you spend, I don't know how many hours. I have a friend who's a weaver, but a long time weaving it. And then do you get nervous before you dye it? Because there's always that opportunity that it'll, after all that time you spent making it, that it won't come out the way that you're hoping.
So most of the time, there are some times where I'm weaving and then I'm over dyeing, but most of the time, that anxiety comes from the painting, because the yarns are dyed first and then I'm weaving it. So that anxiety mostly happens when I'm painting. But like over time, I get over it and I figure it out. And I think what I've also learned is like, being okay with like sort of the fluidity of it, moving from paint to like the woven material and sort of thinking about the back and forth with that. At first I was very, very nervous about it because there's like a preciousness to it, because like you said before, it takes a very long time to produce. But part of that is like sort of letting it go. Like there's always like a risk of, it not working out. So far it's worked out pretty good, but it's also like forced me to be very adaptable. It's forced me to be very adaptable.
Well, one of the things I find really remarkable, the paintings just flew by and I could have looked at them for a lot longer, by the way, next time you give this presentation, is how you incorporated the patterns of the fabric into the patterns of what the figures were wearing. And even there was one painting where she had a skirt on and the pattern on the skirt was the pattern, I think, that you wove or dyed, but then you painted in like the glazing, if you were a painter, of the folds, but that's all you painted.
Yeah,
It's
that's
like
what I do for most of them. That's the same for the one behind me too.
it's just gorgeous.
Yeah,
But do you plan that out so do you know before when you're dyeing it that that's how it's going to be used in the final piece?
Typically, if I'm incorporating it, like it's like usually because I want that pattern to show up on the work. So sometimes the idea for the painting comes from the textile. Sometimes I already have the sketch and then I'm weaving the textile based off of that. But usually when the textile comes first, I'm really thinking about like how the figure works around the textile. So that way when I'm painting, it's just like a matter of like thinking about in those specific areas where you're seeing the shadow and the highlight, how that like sort of bends around the textile itself.
It's beautiful. It's just so amazing. Anyway, that's like, I'll let somebody else ask you a question.
Stephen, are you painting with the dyes or are you using paints?
I'm using paints. I'm using acrylic.
Okay. Have you thought about painting with the dyes?
I have thought about it, like for very thin materials. So I have some work that I'm doing on gauze.
Okay.
I've thought about doing that. I love acrylic painting. Like a lot of painters don't like acrylic. They're like, oh, it's like plastic. I love acrylic painting. So there's something about the opacity of it that I really like. So I think for me, the challenge is, and I'm realizing this more and more as like my work gets put out more in the world. There are some issues with the mediums that I use. For indigo, indigo is like fine. Like there's very little you can do to damage indigo. But for the bar wood that I use, it really does not like acrylic mediums. It looks really nice when you first put it on there, but over time it frosts and it discolors a little bit. So even here, like this pink color is very, very bright on the other side. And at first I was attributing it to, natural dyes aren't light fast. That's just like a reality that the light fastness is not going to be the same as if you're using like chemical dyes, and you just sort of have to let that go. It's fine. It's like it lasts how long it's going to last. But I'm realizing that discoloration, part of that is from the medium that I'm using. So there is some like troubleshooting that I have to figure out with that. But I really like the acrylics because I like the opacity of them, and I like the contrast that happens between like these very opaque parts and these very transparent parts, and then also for some parts where the pattern exists. If you get in close with these, you can see the pattern, the texture of the pattern through them. There's like all these different parts of that that I do appreciate.
Anyone else with any questions?
Can I ask a second question?
Yes.
Because you kind of didn't answer the one I put in the chat. I love the nature, like how you used the word magic, and I realized that's the word I was looking for. So you have these figures, and then floating through your picture plane are these fish and these birds. And one of the pieces that, and it was funny because I wrote to you on the Instagram about it, but I couldn't convey on Instagram how it knocked my socks off, where when the figure had its ankles in water, and the whole painting turned to black and white underwater. So it went from color above the waterline to black and white below the waterline. And then there's these fish. And in that one, like in the one you showed tonight, the fish are very sort of spiritual and floaty and bright. But in that one that was on Instagram, they were dark and they had a frightening presence. And so as a nature illustrator myself, I really, I think the power of critters is very is huge. And so I wanted to hear what your thoughts were with the fish, because the fish seem to be recurring in your imagery.
So fish have a very important, fish and birds play very important like roles in African and Afro-American folklore. So fish and their relationship with water have a lot to do with fertility and fecundity. So we all grow up with like, oh, if your grandmother dreams of fish, it means somebody's pregnant. So like this idea of fish like representing, fertility and plenty. But there's also something about the imagery of water, which is associated with the border between worlds. So the ancestral world is underwater, and a lot of saying it's like water brings us, water takes us away. You come up out the water. Like this idea of water being like this like liminal space between the living world and the ancestral world. So in those instances, both of those fish and both of those paintings are lungfish. There are different species of lungfish that can breathe outside of water. So they sort of represent that liminality between those worlds. So they often become symbols of these deities of water, which are associated with these figures that can live and move between the world of the living and the world of the dead, which is also the world of like birth. So there's always this sort of ambiguity between the end of life and the beginning of life, and these sort of cycles of reincarnation, which are associated with water. And it's very similar with birds. Birds have a lot of ambivalence in African and Afro-American culture. This idea of birds and flight. Birds in Yoruba culture represent the Awon Yawa, the Eleye, the owners of birds, the witches, like those who control these very ambivalent feminine powers that can create or destroy. But they also represent, birds and feathers represent like spiritual power and force. So you see them incorporated in a lot of, not as much anymore, but if you're looking at, Afro-American ritual practices in the antebellum South, or even postbellum South, you see feathers appear. And also in Afro-American folklore, the idea of flying people, or people with wings, who fly back to Africa. They become like these very important presences. Harriet Tubman dreamt that she was a bird flying to freedom, which has all of these very beautiful connotations because it also associates her with the covenant of the Awon, these ideas of these owners of birds. So there's like a very beautiful like ambivalence that's attached to them. And a lot of times they're tied to poetry. So like these ones are from Ejogbe, which is it's an Odun Ifa. So Ifa is a divination corpus of the Yoruba people. It's used it's poetry that's used for divination. And it's from a line from that verse. And it's Aluko dipped its feathers in the camwood paste. So camwood paste is the same dye that I'm using. Camwood is the same dye that I'm using for that red, and it's the color of these birds.
And it's the color of blood also.
Mm-hmm. Which also is very much something that's associated with camwood powder as well.
Thank you. Just one last thing. Toni Morrison, who is one of my favorite writers, has a book that deals with the flying people thing, and she writes about it in its magic. If you've ever if you've read her stuff, I think it's Song of Solomon, mm-hmm. and the main character. Well, it's a spoiler anyway, but it's a very, very vivid imagery about people flying.
Yeah. It's my favorite book, so I know what you're talking about.
Oh, you know the one I've read that like 8 times. I still cry every time. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a couple students that are kind of hiding. Do any of you have any questions?
Are they the ones with their cameras off?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
I have a question. My name's Sarah Khan, and I'm a long-time friend of Suzanne Barnes, and she kindly told me about this event. So thank you for allowing a stranger to come in and benefit from your rich talk. I came in at 7:11. I was like, oh my gosh, I missed the introduction. But my partner is our arts historian of Africa and the African diaspora. So I've been adjacent to him, learning about all that stuff. So I'm just so thrilled to hear about your work. And as someone who works with a dyer in the Rajasthani tradition, to hear the parallels, and also so appreciative of how you, and I said this in the chat, these are living traditions and they're dynamic. We often talk about preserving traditions. No traditions, if they need to be preserved, then they might not be dynamic. So I love how you're taking it that form and making it more dynamic with your own interpretations. But I was also wondering, because I'm probably much older than you, as is my partner, if you might have mentioned if you worked with Nike or descendants of Nike, because she's a longtime elder in the dyeing field in Yoruba land. And I know the wonderful designer in Brooklyn, Wawa Wunmi, who makes her own clothing and is a singer. And so just how are you engaging, if at all, with other community members, and not just in dyeing, but as you allude to, poetry, music, dance, it's all connected.
Yeah. So that's where I
Thank you
learned,
for that.
of course, that's where I learned weaving and dyeing. So I learned at the Nikkei Center. And Chief Nikkei was really awesome. A lot of the knowledge that I have of Indigo is because of her. She's brilliant. And she's also like, you know, not even just indigo, but like learning how to use other natural dyes. Like I've learned a lot from her. I'm still engaged with some folks from Nigeria. I don't have the opportunity to talk to Miss Agnes as much, but she was my weaving teacher and I talk to her as much as I can. And it's very interesting. There's also a connection she has with haystacks. So like, you know, MassArt has like the haystacks trip. She actually taught haystacks in the 70s. So she taught a workshop and she taught one that was open for everybody, but then she taught one that was open, that was specifically for African-American art teachers. And, you know, she's awesome, brilliant. I did not expect to spend as much time with her as I did. Like I thought I would see her once and then that would be, I'd just be shuffled off, but I spent a lot of time talking to her. And what's fascinating about her is that she traveled to markets all over Nigeria, just finding specialists and finding people who would want to teach workshops. So I keep on forgetting her full name, but Miss Sulifa, who was Yalaro in Ibadan, who was the one who like helped her start the workshops, the first workshops, like teaching indigo dyeing. And I know that Gasali was one of the people that was at one of those, that learned at one of those early workshops, but he's also from a dyeing family as well, like a indigo dyeing family as well. But she was one of them. And she also like brought in like all of these other people who were doing wood carving, who were doing weaving. Because she traveled in all of those markets, she also learned about all of these other natural dyes. And even the thing about the Trona, about the you know, the natural soda, she was the one who told me that. And I was like, okay, how do you make the dyes like permanent or activate the dyes? And she was like, yeah, you just throw a little cone in there. You throw a little bit of that in there and it'll make it like fast. And that's what I try with everything. I have like soda ash or like the soda and like I'll be experimenting with those dyes. So yeah, that has been a very integral part of my like learning experience. Learning from her.
Well, we have to see how we can get you to Haystack, maybe with Nikkei.
Hey, Stephen, would you talk about your experience with the MFA?
Awesome. So so the latest experience I had with the MFA was being part of an exhibition that's still up, the Touching Roots exhibition, and me and Karen both in that exhibition. It was a really good experience because I was also one of the consultants for like organizing the exhibition, and it was really important. And this is something that I think is really crucial when thinking about people who work in textiles, especially for us in the diaspora. The exhibition was looking at artists in the African diaspora who were looking at Africa for inspiration. And it was a really amazing experience because not only did I have the opportunity to sort of talk to curators and also other community members about the exhibition, but also to show with all of these people that I admire, all of these artists that I admire, but also sort of highlight the very important role that Africa and experiences and relationships with the African continent have in the work of African-American artists, a lot of whom are textile artists. And that's something that is very important, thinking about textiles as part of a cultural inheritance, thinking about textiles as a crucial part of African and African-American history, and looking at the way that African artists, African-American artists, and artists in the diaspora like explore the use of textiles. So that was the latest experience. I've also, I think my relationship with the MFA started, I mean, it started with me being a teenager working for the teen docent program. That was my first experience working with the MFA. But I also had the opportunity to, visit the MFA and look at the textile collection through Stitched into Memory, through the project I was working with young people with. And that was like a very awesome experience for me there. And then sort of like other relationships sort of springboarded off of that, the MFA collecting my work, things like that. So yeah, that's sort of the latest relationship that I've had with the Museum of Fine Arts. So yeah.
Thank
Does
you.
anybody have, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I just was going to ask people for any more questions. I think this is just such a wonderful discussion.
I agree. This was just great. I really enjoyed getting to see your work and learn more about you, Stephen. And all I can say is it's great. Carry on, upward,
Thank you.
forward, and always more. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, Stephen, I knew you when you were a student, and I knew you as a colleague, and we left MassArt, I think around the same time, both of us. I retired and you went off to Harvard. And it's so delightful to see the trajectory of your career. You are going places, and your work's just gorgeous, and your thinking behind it is gorgeous. And it's just, I love seeing it when it pops up on Instagram. The one thing I would add, though, because I still always have the teacher's hat on a little, is, and I forget your teacher's name, but the one who's very traditional with the dyes and the stuff. When you were talking about putting Liquitex on your dyed fabrics, it made me just a little bit squidgy. That's plastic. So you're putting plastic on your beautiful, beautiful handmade plant dyes. Anyway, I'm sure you've thought of that, and I'm sure others have said that to you, but it's just, it seems like maybe at some point there'll be a way for you to have a technique that works for you, but doesn't involve plastics.
Maybe.
You can put kakishiba, which is persimmon, fermented persimmon juice.
That's right.
And that's a naturally polymerizing liquid. So it turns water repellent, but it does give you a color. So it gives you a reddish brown color that you have to deal with. But there probably are other naturally polymerizing substances that you might be able to use.
That is so true, because I don't know what your medium is or your name. I'm sorry, but I've dyed paper. I've made paper with persimmon, and after you do that, you can't glue it. It repels glue. The glue beads up on it.
Yeah, for me, the medium that I'm using is because I'm painting on it. That's why I'm covering it with it, because I'm using the paint on it, and I don't want to use oil on it because it breaks down the fabric really bad. So
carry on, but
yeah, I'll figure it out. I'll continue experimenting and figuring it out.
Okay. Oh, please.
Soy milk is another substance.
Oh, yay! She turned her camera on.
I did, yeah. I've been cooking, so I didn't really want to be on camera. But the other day I was reading about Navajo weaving for my weaving class, and I learned that like certain styles of weaving or certain like patterns of weaving were kind of like gatekept a little bit because they were sacred, or like only certain people were like qualified isn't the right word, but like spiritually qualified almost. And I was wondering if there was like anything kind of similar when you were learning about dyeing and weaving in Nigeria, because I remember you mentioned something about how they believe that like you kind of deserve this like gift of dyeing and weaving if you're like willing to learn. But yeah, that's kind of my question.
So it depends on where you are. So the context that I was talking about that is amongst the Mende people, amongst Mende women. In the past, there were taboos against men learning dyeing or even touching dye vats. But the thing about that is like traditions evolve and they change. So even in Yoruba land, men typically weren't dyers, but now you'll see male dyers. So those traditions evolve and change. In terms of like the weaving, it depends on where you are. So for example, in the town of Akwete, which is an
Yeah.
Igbo town, there were taboos against men weaving at all. So men could not weave on that loom at all. It was considered an affront to the earth goddess for the men to weave on that loom. It's the same for very particular types of textiles that are woven in certain villages and towns. So in a wool, there are certain textiles that are produced for age-grade ceremonies that I, as a man, wouldn't be allowed to be in the room while they're weaving it.
Yeah.
So that does exist in specific areas, but oftentimes they're in specific areas and as they pertain to specific textiles, and they also change. So for example, the men's weaving tradition, where they're weaving on those long treadle looms. Have you ever seen kente? Traditionally, women weren't allowed to weave on those looms. They weren't allowed to touch those looms because there were taboos against them using it. But those have changed over time. So, you know, that does exist in many parts of Africa, but they also are subject to change depending on context and also depending on like, you know, how cultures think about them. So for example, wood carving was a man's art in the past. But my teacher, who's a wood carver, said, oh, I teach anybody. Anybody who wants to learn, though, they can learn it.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you kind of like face some difficulty trying to learn certain techniques? No? Okay.
No, especially uh 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 there is a I keep on forgetting his name, but he was he's still a dyer. He learned in Nigeria as well. He was Ife Franklin's teacher. His last name is Stanley, or his first name is Stanley, and he taught at the museum school. But when he was at in Nigeria, they were like, Why do you want to learn indigo dyeing?" Like that was still like a taboo for him to learn that.
Yeah.
He was learning like much earlier on. By the time I traveled to Nigeria, that wasn't as much the case. So I never came across any of that when I was there. At the most, people were saying when I was showed that I'm learning weaving, they were like, "Oh, you know, in the past, this is like a women's thing, but it's so good that you're learning it." Like that's what people would say. Like, but it's so good that you're learning it because, again, thinking about people carrying that tradition forward and people having interest in learning traditional things sometimes changes people's attitude towards like who learns it and who gets to learn it. Especially when you're seeing like somebody who is you know, I'm not Yoruba, but my origins are from the continent. So there's something that's also like tied to that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think it's time for us to close down. Thank you so much, Stephen. And if everyone could just give Stephen a hand. And, you know, thank you so much. I feel like you just, you know, you just enriched this entire discussion.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Stephen, I came last week and I waited for 20 minutes and then I realized it was a snow day at MassArt, even though there wasn't a speck of snow.
Yeah.
You should have called me, Suzanne. I know you don't know who I am, but I was waiting too.
Were you waiting? We could have had a chat. But then I thought, oh, maybe I came at the wrong time because I also, now that my brain is getting older, it's getting fuzzier. So I was glad to see it reappear in the feed. And I'm glad, can I have a shout out to my friend Sarah? Hi, Sarah.
Hi, beautiful. Thank you for letting me know about this. I'm really grateful.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much, Karen. And it's good seeing you.
Thank
Good
you,
seeing you, Chandra.
Bye.
Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. See you next week.
Yep. Your old friends were really glad to see you.
Yeah.
They were wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. It was great. It was great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a
Sure.
part of this. I'm
Let me
excited.
turn
Oh.
this, let me stop.